Let's say you're playing Final Fantasy VI and you examine a clock to find an elixir. It heals all your hit points and magic points. Sounds like a pretty good item. You progress through the game and notice your health is a bit low. Sounds like a good time to use that elixir, right? But you still have plenty of MP. Maybe you'll just use some magic to heal up and save that elixir for later. A bit later you notice that your MP is running out. Elixir time, right? But there's a save point here, so just use a sleeping bag instead. You proceed through the game hoarding elixirs but never using them, waiting for the moment you need them. This, my friends, is what I call the Elixir Effect. It's when a mechanic in the game is supposed to be helpful to the player, but it ends up being useless because it was balanced by having a scarce amount of uses, meaning the player will never use it. The most common example I can think of is some kind of super healing item that the player finds rarely, such as Final Fantasy VI's elixirs. They can only be used once, and supply is limited. Only 12 can be gotten outside of battle, 14 if you count guaranteed drops. And while you can get more by stealing or using Ragnarok to transform enemies, you're not going to know which ones give them up without getting lucky or consorting a walkthrough. It gets even worse when you consider Mega Elixirs, which fully heal the whole party. This seems to be a trend a lot of game developers haven't really picked up on. Even as late as Dark Souls, it's affecting its game design with items like the Divine Blessing. It fully heals and removes any status effects, which makes it a great healing item. It can also be picked as a starting gift, so players can have 3 of them guaranteed right off the bat. However, players quickly get their Estus flasks in the same area, so the blessings are quickly stored away in the realm of when I really need them, and are quickly forgotten. Divine Blessings are rare as well, so players wind up using Estus for topping off their health, or Humanity for healing in PvP. On top of all this, it's even worse in Dark Souls 3, where the inventory system means the player can only hold one at a time, with the rest being put into storage. Meanwhile, I have almost nothing but praise for the Estus system, since it's about as close to a perfect system that I can think of. The player knows their Estus flask will always be refilled at bonfires, so they have no qualms with using them unless their health is too high. And developers can design areas and bosses around how many flasks they think the player will have at any one time. It also allows for the player to make the game easier, either by trading in Firekeeper souls to increase the amount of healing they do, or by kindling bonfires, giving more drinks when the player sits at that specific bonfire. Kindling bonfires does come with its own risks, however. To kindle, the player must unhollow first, which puts them at risk for invading players. They may end up avoiding kindling at places with a higher invasion rate, such as Anor Londo. It's a pretty difficult area with one of the hardest bosses in the game, so they'll probably try to make it through with as many of their 5 flasks as they can, since going back to sit at an earlier bonfire means at least going back to the start of the area. This is further complicated by how when other players kindle their bonfire, the player can get an extra Estus flask, one that won't be recharged after they use it, so they'll try to save it for that one perfect run against the Super Lando Bros fight. Even normal common items can be under the Elixir Effect, such as Vulneries and Fire Emblem. A simple healing item shouldn't cause this, but since Vulneries only come in stacks of 3, and each stack takes up one of the unit's 5 inventory spaces, their use by the player becomes scarce, with them just collecting dust until the player tosses them out to make room for a new weapon, or another healing item, just to follow the cycle all over again. The Elixir Effect is by no means limited to inventory items. Abilities that are tied to a timer can also be affected, such as rechargeable abilities like the Talisman and Weapon abilities of the 2014 Gauntlet reboot, meter-based super modes like Intenso Mode and Guacamelee, or tide turning abilities such as Overwatch's character-specific ultimates. Most of the ultimates are balanced well enough to avoid this problem. They charge slowly enough to not be the only thing players rely on, but consistently enough to not discourage the player from ever using them. The one I feel most suffers from this is Mercy's Revive ultimate. Since it revives all dead teammates near her, it can pressure the player to not use the ability unless they're reviving most of their team at the same time. Even if reviving only, say, 2 would be enough to make for a successful push. Contrast this with the medic from Team Fortress 2 and his Uber Charge. When it's fully charged, it can be used to grant the medic and his target 8 seconds of invulnerability, so it needs to be timed properly. However, this charge is lost if the medic dies before using it, which has led to the player mentality of pop it, don't drop it. Even if the only thing the Uber accomplishes is for the medic to get back to his team unharmed, it still means that he's able to provide healing and support without waiting for a respawn timer. One method or the other, having a meter charge during death or loss upon death, isn't inherently better than the other, since they both work to avoid this effect in their own way. The Elixir Effect can actually be used to a game's advantage, such as in Resident Evil. Being a survival horror game, it seeks to instill a sense of terror and helplessness onto the player. One of the ways it does this is through its health system. The player character has a set amount of health, and being damaged by enemies reduces that health, causing the character to die when it empties out. That's standard for a lot of games. However, rather than use a health bar or display the amount with numbers, it uses a vague status window in the pause screen, meaning the player won't have an accurate idea of what their health actually is. This causes the players to hoard their healing items, especially their mixed herbs, which helps reinforce a sense of danger due to the character being more vulnerable and the player not knowing to what extent. So now that we know what's causing the problem, it begs the question, how do we fix it? From a player's standpoint, the solution is pretty simple. Force yourself over this mental hurdle by just using it. Having other players encourage this can also help, such as in MMOs. Final Fantasy XIV requires the player to actively use buffs and abilities in any content that requires multiple people. Tanks especially not using their abilities to help mitigate damage will be quickly noticed by healers having to redouble their efforts to keep them alive. In this behavior will have these players hit a wall once they hit in-game content. From a developer's standpoint, solutions are less obvious, but they do exist. One way is to make it seem like there isn't a limit to the use of these mechanics. Dark Souls 2 is hit particularly hard due to its soul memory system. Whenever players gain souls, the game's currency and experience, it gets added to a total soul count, and this count never decreases, even if the player spends these souls or loses them by dying. This is what determines the range of players that can invade and be invaded, which means playing online will consistently become harder regardless if the player improves their character or not. This makes spending souls on consumable items, such as ammunition or items to buff weapons or defenses, counterintuitive since it's a temporary bonus that makes the game permanently harder. This could be worked around by, say, making items like the gold pine resin have infinite uses, but having those uses tied to either a timer or sitting at a bonfire, with more or longer uses being granted by finding more pine resin. If that seems broken, consider that if the soul memory system was removed, there would be nothing stopping the player from grinding for enough souls to just buy 99 resin, and having enough for every encounter in the game. Another method could be to literally force the player to use a mechanic when it's useful. Several games in the shmup genre have some kind of bomb system, where the player can clear the screen of projectiles a limited number of times. Certain shmups have an autobomb system, such as Space Moth DX here. Instead of losing a life, the game instead automatically uses a bomb, clearing the screen, saving the player, and encouraging the player to use bombs themselves. This kind of mechanic is most useful for newer players who might be too overwhelmed to remember their bombs. And such a system won't be needed by more skilled players, who would instead prefer to use bombs when it would get them the most points. Thirdly, give the player the option to change their mind about using the mechanic. In Torchlight 2, the player can find gems to socket into equipment to give them better stats or unique abilities. However, being a Diablo-like, it could only be about 20 minutes of playing before better equipment and gems come along to replace them. This is why a pair of NPCs exist, one to destroy gems, freeing up their sockets, and one to destroy equipment, allowing reuse of gems. A feature in the first Torchlight was to combine multiple of the same gem to make one of a higher tier, a feature conspicuously absent from the sequel since players just saved their gems without using them. Not a problem in the second game. Unless you mod it back in, of course. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't stop them from min-maxing, I suppose. This is a last minute thing, but there's an example that encapsulates this moment perfectly. During the best friend's Let's Play of Resident Evil 7, Pat picks up a steroid, an item that increases the character's max HP and fully heals them. Instead of using it, he holds onto it, puts it in storage, and is then killed by an enemy because he had low health and no health items on him. All because the item was too valuable to use.